As a performer, your body is there.
Hi, I'm Mad Kate, and you're listening to S.W.E.A.T, Sexuality, Work, Extraction, Art, Theatrics. S.W.E.A.T is a series of conversations about performance and performativity of the sexual and sexualized body at work, where work is broadly defined as the labor of survival, the labor of care, creativity, and capital A art. How exactly do we define our work? And how does that work entangle and circumscribe our sexual identities, our creative lives, and the way in which we provide care? How do we perform tasks, acts of care, and identities? Anchored in our always already racialized and sexualized bodies, our complex intersectionalities, these conversations are a means of relating through work to each other. I hope they contribute to dialogues which normalize sex work as work, and all work is deserving of respect, healthy conditions, and a living wage.
Activism is embarrassing. You are put on the line, you get arrested, you get shoved to the ground, someone sprays something in your face, and you go from being like this moral citizen to like crying in the street. It's embarrassing. So I said, if we can study this, we can allow ourselves to be embarrassed for 2.5 minutes at the beginning of every class, put on music, get in our body, shake, move around, and remember that AIDS activists went dancing after every single one of their actions.
What's bugging me a lot lately is that current events feel pretty bad. But at the same time, I want to resist the temptation to fall into the idea that things are worse than they've ever been before. I'm pretty sure that's not objectively true, or true for everyone, or if violent events are simply being presented and appearing in new ways. And what we may risk is falling into nostalgia for times when things were already quite bad, but we weren't acting to prevent the present we're seeing now. What I'd rather do is assume that we still have significant blind spots and look more deeply to see what are the things we should be doing now, not only as a band-aid to the violence of the present, but as preventative against violent futures. My conversation this month is with queer and feminist cultural historian, educator, podcaster, and public speaker Ramzi Fawaz. I feel like I say this every month, but it was truly a delight to toss around ideas with him, especially thinking together about the power of radical imagination, fantasy, and psychedelia towards a present in which we can effectively coexist.
I love fantasy. Not all fantasy is escapism. I want fantasies that bring me joy and also help me by giving me tools to change the conditions of my existence in the real world.
Ramzi Fawaz is a professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and host of the podcast Nerd from the Future. He's the author of 2 books, including The New Mutants, Superheroes and the Radical Imagination of American Comics, and Queer Forms, both published by NYU Press. Fawaz is currently working on a new book project titled How to Think Like a Multiverse, Psychedelic Pathways to Embracing a Diverse World. In it, he argues for a rethinking of humanities education as a form of collective psychedelic therapy, which uses literature, art, and media rather than psychoactive medicines to induce positive, long-term transformations in students' mental health and well-being.
I wake up these days thinking about why I feel the need to go on social media. Social media is not something that until the last couple of years has been particularly top of mind. Mm-hmm. You know, I spend a lot of time thinking about mental health, the study of literature and media and culture and psychedelics. And I have lately found myself waking up thinking about the need to turn on social media in order to feel that I matter or am important to some external world. And I don't even have a huge social media following anyway. So I really think a lot about why that feels so top of mind. I think it is the feedback loop of like the more and more that the political world seems chaotic in the United States, there is this incredible impulse to seek escapism in a virtual world of people telling you that you are good and valuable and attractive and desirable. And as being a middle-aged gay person, you know, I want to be free of that. Like, I really don't want to feel the pull of the need to seek some kind of external validation that my ideas or my body or the way I look or my new headshots or whatever are palatable to other people. And yet it does nag at me. The need to look at my phone has felt more and more necessary lately. And I think about that a lot. The Buddhist side of me really thinks about, what is it that I'm attached to here? What is this doing for me? So it's the first time that I've really started to feel like one of the people, like we're all experiencing this simultaneously. The pull of seeking out this thing in order to get something external. And it feels so primal and exhausting. And it takes up a huge amount of my time. That is, for an academic, you really need your time. As you know, as an artist, as an academic, you need your time to read, think, write. So I'm grateful for my writing, because I find that once I get into my writing, I don't want to check my phone, because I'm actually like doing a sustained kind of meditative practice. But that is weird to me, that that's what I'm waking up thinking about. And so I would love to figure out my way around it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge topic of late in the art world in Berlin. There was kind of movement among some friends and people that were like, let's all jump off in the first day of 2026. And we didn't manage to collectively do this. And part of why we felt like it needed to be a collective jump off is because we all feel, especially as underground artists, more or less, that we depend on it for spreading news about our events.
It's an amazing advertising.
Essentially, yeah. I mean, it feels that way. Although I think sometimes there's also this illusion.
Sure.
And yet I didn't find the way to jump off either. And I think I struggle with the idea of whether or not social media really is this other animal, or if it is just reality. Like, I think sometimes it gets labeled as though it's like a separate hell. But then I kind of look at real life and I wonder if it isn't just a different kind of mirror, like if we can really escape it even if we go off it.
It's interesting because of the work I've been doing in human psychology and psychedelics. I have been tending to describe lots of large structural realities in interpersonal terms lately. I've been kind of flipping the left-wing social justice project, which is always to turn everything interpersonal into structure.
Yes.
Right? The general left-wing social justice thing is to be like, we had an argument at a coffee shop and it's an expression of you being like a representative of the patriarchy and a representative of homophobia or whatever. Like, there's a tendency to read everything in structure. And I've been doing the opposite, which is reading structures as interpersonal dynamics.
Yes.
And I think that social media is like a situationship. And I think that a situationship is only every once in a while giving you something really pleasurable. Mm-hmm. Like where you have an amazing tryst with your lover and the sex is incredible and you feel so good. And then because that moment was so great, you're like, I'm going to keep texting that person.
Right.
Because I want to reclaim that beautiful, amazing thing. And the reality of the situationship is that it can only be every once in a while. And it cannot actually provide the sustained and sustainable, both chemical, psychological fulfillment that you're looking for. And I think that we continue to return to this media form that is part of reality. Like another way of saying it is it's neither reality nor not reality. It's like one sliver of what it means to be a person in the world. And we metastasize it. We like expand its role to the point that it actually feels like everything. And putting it in its place is really the difficulty. I've heard so many psychologists talk about going cold turkey doesn't work because it is a part of our social ecology. Also. So to me, it's like it really is about how do you put it in its place and say, this is what it's for. The occasional momentary putting on blast, interesting work, ideas, etc., getting a message out, occasionally seeking some kind of validation and then saying, okay, now I'm going to leave for a while and I'll come back. I find very difficult because the impulse is to approach it compulsively. And so I've been trying to view it in terms of interrelationships and be like, how do I put it in its place?
I love that. I mean, I think the other aspect I get out of it is this feeling of, should I be thinking about, I'm not thinking, so
Correct.
like negative feedback, which I wouldn't actually feel is like guilty. I mean, I think it's important to also be checked. So I don't mind that. Like, I don't mind someone being like, that was a performative action, blah, blah, blah. But it does sometimes feel like I'm being tossed around all over the place by the left,
yes,
about
correct.
like Right.
Totally. Well, because it's it's like a space of great moralizing. If you want to make sure that I don't listen to you, moralize at me. I will just tell you, as somebody that considers themselves very politically minded, very committed to democratic thought, but also a thinker more than an activist, right? I do my activism through my teaching and through my thinking. And the first line of moralizing on the left is the classroom isn't really activism. And I'm like sitting with 30 to 330 young people at a time and improving their capacity to think and participate in civic life is a major political act. So I have really developed a very strong defense against moralizing, because I also think that moralizing is a deeply sentimentalized logic that is about manipulating people's emotions rather than making meaningful arguments for getting people on board to why what you're doing matters. And I don't fundamentally believe that atrocity can be responded to through sentimentality. Like, it's a demand to be over-identified with suffering. And I'm like, my job is to help suffering stop. It's not to be over-identified with the suffering of people I don't know. That's like a very classic democratic political theory thing, you know? And so I don't respond to the attempt to manipulate my emotions. I respond to people saying, hey, by the way, you might not have noticed this. I would like to put it in front of you and see what you think. And then I'm like, oh, now I want to engage.
I think it's tricky. I think it's we have different strategies, and what's clear to me is at the end of the day, if your strategy doesn't work, if your strategy isn't changing the minds of the people that you want to have their minds changed, then you have to change your strategy. But yet, you know, like it's hard to know what works, and also like the same thing doesn't work for everyone.
You have to experiment. Absolutely. I could not agree with you more. I tell my students all the time, you have a massive, vast arsenal of strategies for changing things in your world. And most of them will not work in many different contexts, but some of them will. And you have to be willing to practice saying truths in different ways until you see what lands.
I agree. And I think the other side of that is also practicing a kind of listening, which might not necessarily require the other person to constantly translate themselves. So it's really like a relational thing. Let's go to teaching, because teaching is absolutely activism in my mind, because that's where people get radicalized. I mean, I got really radicalized going to school. I'm curious, like what, you know, I kind of labeled my questions through the body. So in a corporal or like in a somatic sense, what does it feel like for you in the body when you are performing this teacher role?
What a beautiful question. I feel radiant. I feel that when I am in the position of the leader or a facilitator of a conversation, I did this on Monday for my class on AIDS activism. I said, my number one job is I am your interlocutor. I am somebody who's supposed to talk back and forth with you. I don't know everything. I know more about AIDS activism than you all do. I know way less than people who've been AIDS activists their whole lives, right? Like I know way less than people whose entire research agenda is about AIDS activism. It is a slice of what I study. But I say to them, like, my job is to throw ideas back and forth with you to help you figure out what you believe. And when I'm in that role, I feel sort of like radiant, like I am pulsating outward or modeling through my body's like rhythmic pulsation, excitement about these ideas. Like I remind students, I'm very loud, I'm very opinionated, I'm very energetic. And I have to remind Midwestern students who've grown up in a culture of emotional austerity that has told them that outward displays of emotion are flamboyant and inappropriate and crazy, that I'm not mad at them. I have to remind them that I'm modeling for them what it means to be ecstatic about ideas, and that I'm showing them that they're allowed to be that way. So, I mean, in the opening 2 minutes of my class, I put on a dance mix from SoundCloud and I made them dance for 2.5 minutes.
Wow.
I told them, I said, okay, we're going to be spending a semester talking about people arranging themselves in public. Like activism is embarrassing. You are put on the line Minneapolis was just happening like the day before. And I said to them, I was like, you get arrested, you get shoved to the ground, someone sprays something in your face, and you go from being like this moral citizen to like crying in the street. It's embarrassing. So I said, if we can study this, we can allow ourselves to be embarrassed for 2.5 minutes at the beginning of every class, put on music, get in our body, shake, move around, and remember that AIDS activists went dancing after every single one of their actions. And so it's fun to watch the students check into that in their own way. There are people who want to be in the middle of the room dancing. There are people who want no one to ever look at them. And then there are people who are bopping in their mind with their eyes closed. Every single position is acceptable. So I feel like my job is to pulsate. It's to be a radiant light. And that's sort of what I feel at this stage in my career, because I trust myself in the classroom now. I've been teaching in some form or another college students for 23 years, since I was an undergrad. And now I go in and I sort of know what I'm doing. And I have nerves, but I'm sort of I'm just one of my therapists once said that he thought of me as a bodhisattva. And I thought that was what? And the more I've become a lay Buddhist, the more I understand, we're all supposed to be bodhisattvas. That's what, you're supposed to be a radiant light of knowledge and open love. And that's sort of what I bring to the classroom. My students sort of know that I'm radiating love. I'm so excited to be there with them.
That's beautiful. One of the things that you said about the participation reminds me of the way I approach immersive performance, which is darkroom politics. So when you enter the darkroom, you're part of the performance, but that doesn't mean you have to be at the center or on the sling. You can play all the different roles.
Beautiful. Exactly. It's funny that you have to give permission to people to inhabit any number of roles, but you do.
Permission, and also reminder that when they're entering, they're not passive consumers. I mean, that they're actively there, that you're not invisible as well. But also, part of what I got from the Bodhisattva's metaphor is also that there's this calmness, right, with which you must approach this. But what kinds of things do you do to be able to maintain that feeling of joy and radiance?
I'm glad you're asking that, because there's been a major transformation for me in the last 4 years, I would say. I think it's fair to say that until I achieved the rank of full professor, which I arrived at that very early in my career. I mean, many people don't arrive at full professor until their 50s and 60s. And I achieved it when I was 37. And that was because I had just moved very quickly. And I think through the career, and I was very fortunate to be supported hugely by my university with amazing research funding and all of that to get my second book done. But I had a moment when that happened where I thought, wow, I moved so fast, but this is not a 50-yard dash. It's a marathon. I'm only 1/3 of the way through the career. I have another 20 to 25 years, depending on how long I teach. And I thought, I have to rethink my relationship to this thing because it needs to be sustainable. It's no longer about achieving ranks. It's about entering new realms of possibility in my teaching and my research. And one of the words that came to my mind when I did a lot of meditative work around this period of my life was adventure. I was I need to adventure. I need to go out into the world. I need to stop thinking of myself as a brain on a stick, as one of my early therapists once told me. And I really need to inhabit all of the different parts of my body. And so there were a number of things that emerged out of that. One was that I returned to my yoga practice, which I've had for 20 years. One of my mentors kind of said to me in grad school, you're so brilliant, but you're so wound tight. And you really do need to go to yoga. And that changed my life. So I returned to my yoga practice. I started traveling just for adventure, not for work. I remember the moment being in New Zealand at Milford Sound, one of the most extraordinary places you can ever go. It's a famous fjord, and just being moved to tears by how much the waterfalls regulated my nervous system. I just really started to feel like a sensate being with a body. I did psychedelic therapy for the first time, which completely altered my sensorium. So little by little, I began to understand that all the things I love doing the most in the world, like learning, reading, writing, which I loved so much that I had shoved away everything my body needed in order to do them, I just realized that I could actually return to them with so much more love, attention, and commitment, precisely because I nourished myself as a body.
It feels like a lot of what you do and what you talk about is the way that you care. I mean, you already talked a bit about having your students get up and dance, and I feel like this is an act of care. How else is teaching, or the way that you teach, an act of care?
I think the number one way in which teaching is an act of care is that it's about attention. I am giving young people my 1,000% undivided attention. When people attack public university or all universities in the United States, they say that we're radicalizing students, that we're biased. What they forget is that young people are sent to these institutions where brilliant, passionate, excited, creative human beings with a lot of training in their field spend thousands of hours focusing on your children, giving them undivided attention, asking them questions, curious about their ideas. So I remind my students in a glib, joking way. I say, you're 20 years old, you don't know fuck all about anything, and yet I really care about what you think. Like, I want to know what your ideas are and how they're developing. And so that's number one, is just that I see myself as a civil servant. I owe something to the public because I work at a public university. And one of the gifts that I provide is that I pay attention to what students are saying and I respond. And I cannot tell you the number of times that students will do something either really beautiful and brilliant. They'll say something incredible and I will sort of stop the class. And I will say, I want that to sink in right now, like for everyone. And then I'll restate what the person said. And I can see how much that means to them.
Beautiful.
Right? They're just like, oh my God, right? And then the opposite. I will see a student do something questionable. I'll see a student use AI in a paper or whatever. And I will pull them aside and be like, hey, what's going on? Like, why would you turn in something that's essentially cheating? And they're like, I didn't even think you would notice, right? Like, and so the fact that I'm paying attention, that I'm not being punitive, like I'm not saying to that student, I'm going to destroy your grade now and you're going to flunk the class. I like look at them and I'm like, babe, listen, like, you can do better, right? And you know that I am interested in your growth and you could have turned in the worst paper of your life and it still would have been better than you using AI. And they are so moved that I care enough to be so invested in their growth. And I've learned that when I do that, my students will get on board with everything. A second form of care is that I don't agree with everything that they say. I actually function as a sounding board that's willing to say, are you sure about that?
Yeah.
Could you explain that to me? Do you really believe that? I mean, my students say things all the time that I don't actually think they believe. Yeah. And I'm like, do you really believe that? And then like they stop and think about it. They're like, I don't know. And I'm like, okay, so it sounds like you're repeating something you've heard. Right. What do you actually believe about this thing, right? So I guess the second way I would put it is that I treat what they say as something that needs to be judged reasonably. And what I mean by that is not that I'm judgmental of them. It's like I'm judging what they're saying by thinking it through and saying, that sounds like a great idea. Or like, I'm not so sure about that. And I'm encouraging them to make their own judgments. So those are two really powerful forms of care. And then finally, I just think that I'm a very loving presence. Like, I think my students know I'm friendly. I'm approachable. I make jokes. I allow people to make mistakes. I remind students they're allowed to say something in class that offends people. And my job is to be their advocate and to say, I want to explain to you why that might be offensive to people without telling you that you're a bad person. Right. So another way to describe this is that I'm everybody's advocate. Like, I had a couple students come up to me this week after our first session who were so lovely. And they said, I'm so excited about this class, but I have to be honest, I don't know anything about the history of AIDS. And I don't know about queer people. And I'm worried I'm going to say something that's going to offend people. And I said, if you knew everything about queer people and AIDS activism or whatever, then why would you be in this class? Right. Right. Like, I don't expect you to know anything. Like, that's why we're doing this class. And so there's going to be some people in the class that are more knowledgeable because these are things they're interested in and they've studied them or they've participated in activism. And there's many of you that are here just to learn. And your view, your opinion matters. And I want to know what you think precisely so that we can be surprised. Maybe you have ideas that are shocking and surprising and useful that we didn't know. And second, if you do have ideas that are deeply offensive, I want to know them, because I want to know where they came from. And I want to be able to lovingly say, here's why this might not be such a great idea, right? Like,
right.
Again, in a non-moralizing way, because how could you know otherwise? Like, one student said, I grew up in a very, very religious background, and I'm concerned that, some of those ideas really did get implanted in me. And I said, first of all, that means that in the class, you're somebody who knows more about religious practice than the rest of us.
Like it's a gift.
Right? Like, you know about what it's like to be, yeah. And one of the things we do in the class is we listen to this new podcast. I'm forgetting what it's called. It's something like We're All Gonna Get Into Heaven. That is a documentary podcast about the first church to accept people with AIDS in the Christian church in the United States, in San Francisco, and how they weathered that period. And I told her, I said, we're going to listen to that podcast and you're going to have a lot to say.
Beautiful. I mean, I think that one of the most important things, is what I feel like you're saying, is to teach critical thinking at this point, because, especially in this terrain of social media, and also why it's so scary to feel like what you say is being heard by everyone, being judged by everyone. To do critical thinking feels like one of the most important things we can do at this point.
I couldn't agree more. And I actually want to say, we often use the phrase critical thinking constantly to talk about what we do at school or what we do in education or in activism. And I remind people, there's many different modes of critical thought. One is being able to focus your attention on something in the world, an event, an art object, right? Critical thinking that just says, I'm going to focus my energies and my attention, and I'm going to ask myself questions inside my head. What is happening to me when I look at this painting? What is happening to my body when I see this performance? That's like critical thinking layer 1. Critical thinking layer 2 is to take in multiple perspectives, to be like, now I have a handle on what's happening with me. I wonder what's happening to other people. I wonder how other people read this moment or this artwork or this event. And absorbing, right? This is what Hannah Arendt, the political philosopher, calls enlarged mentality. She's borrowing from Immanuel Kant, the great philosopher. This idea of I take in multiple perspectives, not because I'm going to become those people, not because I'm going to claim empathy even, but because I want to know how other people are seeing the same thing. And level 3, which is my hobby horse, and I talk about it all the time, is then being able to take all those perspectives alongside your own experience and make a judgment call and be like, here's where I'm going to stand on this thing for now. And I might change my mind when more data comes through. I'm going to respond to what I'm seeing and then I'm going to be changed by it, but I'm still going to stand from my position. I'm not going to just say what other people want me to say. And I think a lot of progressive students today abandon their critical thinking when they fear that they might have a position on a topic or an event that other people will not like because they don't want to be annihilated by other people. And so instead of critical thinking, what they do is they listen to what other people are saying on trend, and then they repeat it like pablum. And that's where I ask students on the whole perspective of left, right, center, whatever. Do you really believe that? Do you really believe this thing that you just said about race? Or about gender? Do you really believe this thing about healthcare or whatever? Because I want them to stop and be like, actually, I believe part of that, but I also believe this. And I'm like, that's when original thought happens. When you share your genuine perspective without the constant anxiety of not being liked or people being mad at you. And a huge part of the work I have to do in classes now is to disabuse students of the idea that they must be liked all the time in order to survive.
Of course, it is so difficult. And I think not only for students, but for everyone.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel terrified of it too. And I think it's a precarity, right? And depending on where you are, you either get never asked to be platformed or you get deplatformed, depending on what we're talking about. Again, it's It's difficult because, like, of course, I understand wanting to teach, students to be able to always speak their mind. And yet, like, how do we navigate that, what actually is consequential?
Well, you just asked the right question. How do we navigate? And you used the word discernment earlier, and you cannot discern the stakes of every conversation without being better at taking risks and seeing what happens. Like, if you never ever take risks as a young person in a space, like I remind my students, in the space of the classroom, this is practice. This is a low stakes environment where, like, I'm not going to ruin your life. We are here in a cone of trust. So you get to practice saying things, realizing what's offensive, what's not, so that when you're out in the public sphere, you make better decisions about what you say. And you're also better navigate when you say something that is maybe off, you're able to, like, go back and say, you know what, I'm rethinking what I just said. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's another thing, the ability to admit that maybe you rethought something.
I want to go back to, maybe it connects, maybe imagination and psychedelics is one of the things in our toolboxes. You mentioned that when you were in New Zealand, I think you did your first therapeutic psychedelic trip. Maybe I'm misquoting you, so correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I did my first therapeutic psychedelic trip in Los Angeles. But doing it intentionally in a group, guided with a therapist, was mind-boggling. And, I laugh now because I shouldn't be surprised. I'm a teacher who facilitates collective, intentional spaces of learning and growth. And I don't think it should have surprised me that was transformative to do it in a more structured way.
You're writing a new book called How to Think Like a Multiverse, Psychedelic Pathways to Embracing a Diverse World.
Yeah.
I would love to hear about how psychedelics and maybe how it dovetails with imagination is allowing for ways of seeing and being with each other in the world.
So the book is driven by a single, powerful, timely question, which is what is required to cultivate the mindset necessary to respond to difference in a loving, nonviolent way. Like, we are living in a world in which xenophobia, the absolute hatred of difference, is at such a fever pitch on this planet. The fact that there are people in the United States who fundamentally believe that they are being racially replaced by other people, the idea that people feel that the existence of transgender or gender nonconforming people is an existential threat to their own presence on this planet, there has to be a response that says you do not have to live this way. There are other ways to look at the world and say, wow, there's lots of different people in it. That is so fascinating. I wonder why. What is required to approach human difference and diversity with a sense of curiosity and wonder and excitement? And the book says it's interesting that at this moment that we need to answer this question so badly, people around the globe are turning to psychedelics to be able to deal with rigid thought processes. Like, that's why people are turning to psychedelics. Mm-hmm. All of the things people are hoping to treat with psychedelic medicines in the Western world, anxiety, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, etc., trauma, these are forms of rigid thinking patterns, right? So what I'm intrigued by is why that industry is focused only or primarily on using psychedelic medicines to treat the symptoms of mass immiseration. Yeah. As opposed to also asking, that's a worthwhile project, but at the end of the day, there is no magic bullet to mass immiseration. Mass immiseration is solved by collective structural transformation that is connected to change. So, like, my question in the book is, what would it look like to take the lessons we are learning from the medical study, the neurobiological study of psychedelics, and to link them to the insights of humanities education, which is incredibly good at teaching young people how to approach human diversity with an open mind? And so part of what I say is that humanities education today should be thought of as a form of psychedelic therapy. We just don't use drugs. We use art, media, and other kinds of historical objects to invoke massive emotionally transformative experiences in young people. And then we sit every week in a classroom and we process those experiences in a very similar way to the process of psychedelic integration. And so what I'm trying to say is that psychedelic experience might be a broad spectrum of experiences in the world that are not only about ingesting psychedelic drugs, but that are about invoking affectively transformative outcomes in the body that might make you more open to encountering difference and diversity, like in a softer, gentler, more open-hearted way. Like, I really just want to solve certain problems. I really want to understand what it looks like to get people to be less attached to rigid identitarian thinking around difference.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that links very well to imagination. I mean, to me, imagination is kind of psychedelic.
Absolutely.
It's a choice. It's a choice that we make to be psychedelic in a sense. You know, if we're going to say, let's play a game, let's play a role-playing game.
Yeah.
Let's play a game where, I mean, I think a lot about like Butler's idea of grievability, right? Like if we really consider that every life is worth grieving and grievable, and we're really treating each other in that way. I mean, every single person in the world. That's a lot. That's so much to hold in terms of mourning.
Absolutely, yeah.
But, you know, in this imaginary sense, if we had this ability, like, what would we do differently, right? How would we act differently?
Sure.
And I think these kind of imagination games are so useful, even when it comes to just the tiny interpersonal relations that we have. You know, again, you're like linking the structural to the interpersonal. Like in queer sex, for example, I feel like I use imagination all the time to kind of imagine somebody else the way they want to be imagined in their body, whether or not they actually look that way.
Sure.
But to play and for sex to have that imaginative psychedelia. Yeah, I mean, what kind of imagination games, if you would put it that way, would you say you play with?
Yeah, well, let me start by giving my definition of imagination. I mean, I borrow from the feminist political theorist Linda Zerilli, who is my heart song. Her work is probably, next to Hannah Arendt, like the most important influence on my work. You know, she says in her book, Feminism and the Abyss of Freedom, she says, imagination is a cognitive capacity. It is an ability, it's like a birthright of the human species. It is the ability to project existing categories, identities, events, people, you name it, into unfamiliar contexts in order to think what they might do and what they might become in those contexts, right? So, like, what is the fundamental imagination of radical feminism? It is, what could a woman be? Right? It's about how do you project the categories of gender or woman or whatever into a new context.
Yes.
So, like, at its core, feminism is imaginative because it's an attempt to take existing categories, man, woman, gender nonconforming, whatever, and put them in a new place. You know, a feminist imaginary can imagine somebody who's born with male genitalia being a woman, right? Like, a feminist imaginary just accepts that there are trans people in the world because it projects those categories into new contexts. It is like, oh, I guess under this context, there could be men who are women. And there could be women who are men, right? Like, it is a loosening of the grip of some of these identities and of these categories. And so in my work, what I do is I seek out cultural objects, movies, artworks, literature, video games that really actively work on projecting existing categories into places you could never imagine and seeing what happens to them. So, I mean, one of the texts I write about in the book is Everything Everywhere All at Once. Like, a movie that projects the figure of the Asian American immigrant woman into a million different possible alternate realities, to the point that it becomes so imaginative that, like, it stretches the limit of your capacity to cognize some of the stuff. I mean, there is a world, if you recall, in which people have hot dog hands. Right? Like this is so beyond the pale of what you could imagine. There's a universe she goes to in which she's playing out Ratatouille, the movie, but with a raccoon. It's so imaginative, it's so creative that you suddenly can think more expansively about what identity is. And that is the power of the sharing of a perspective. Like the people who wrote that movie, the Daniels, they have minds that are so creative and expansive, and they're sharing them with us as an audience. And in so doing it, they are expanding what we can even know and think and believe about the world. So for me, art objects are all imaginative experiments. And the cultural objects I'm least interested in are the ones that don't go far enough, that are not as imaginative as they could be, right?
Can you give me a for example?
What is a good example? I mean, actually, since I'm writing about it, Heated Rivalry is a great example. You know, this is an incredibly sexy show. It's fun. I enjoy watching it to a degree. I love the actors in it. I'm delighted that they're becoming so famous. But all of the public discourse, the obsession with the show, is basically saying we love the show because it provides us a fantasy that works to compensate for all of the failures of the sex and dating pool. You know, straight women that are loving it are saying, I'm seeing a form of intimacy and passion between men that I can never imagine having with straight men in my life. Gay men are fantasizing about the perfect boyfriend. And I'm like, the solution on offer in the show is a product of the very problem that we face. It's not helping us fix the dating pool. It's helping us escape out of it in our minds. Part of the reason the dating pool is so awful is because we're all driven by these fantasies of Prince Charming. Because nobody lives up to our values, because we're always projecting all of these wants and needs on people that they cannot fulfill. And the show is saying, no, you will find your Prince Charming. That's the out that it's offering. And that's not that imaginative to me. You know, I think that a show like Somebody Somewhere is actually about queer people accepting that sometimes they will be in love and sometimes they won't, and sometimes it'll work out and sometimes it won't, but their friends will be there forever. Right? Like it has this idea that it's like, actually, if you're struggling with the dating pool, maybe what you should do is become better friends with people. And maybe friendship will be the basis interpersonally for producing a better relationship to the people that you pursue romantically. Like that to me is like actually useful.
Yeah.
Imaginatively. That's helping me solve something. That's not helping me escape the problem. It's giving me a vision of something that is useful.
I mean, this to me gets at like one of the issues is this distinction between imagination as escapism versus imagination as kind of a tool for personal transformation. Like I almost wonder if we need different words.
Yes,
because
correct.
It feels confusing in a way.
I think you're so right. And I think that what I have grown to find frustrating is that in a world that is as painful, violent, and difficult to confront as the one we're living in today, many people feel that they have a right to their escapism. And they have a right to be attached to cultural objects that allow them to disappear from reality. Like nobody was able to critique Heated Rivalry. That's why I'm writing this essay. It's like a media object that is Teflon. Anytime someone publicly said anything negative about the show, people immediately defend it on the grounds that the world is hell and why don't you just let us have our fantasies? And my thing is like, girl, the world is hell because we all live in denial about reality. Like the reason the world is hell is because we're all collectively in denial about everything from climate change to ghosting to social media, right? Like we don't need more denial. That's not a meaningful solution to the things that harm us. That's what Lauren Berlant would call cruel optimism. You know, the endless attachment to the things that hurt us. I am a person who spent my whole career studying fantasy. I love fantasy. Not all fantasy is escapism. I want fantasies that bring me joy and also help me by giving me tools to change the conditions of my existence in the real world. I want fantasies that are approachable, that are attainable, that I can actually bring some element of into my life. So it's like more power to you if Heated Rivalry is changing your life and like blah, 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 blah. To me, I look at that show as a middle-aged gay man who has had to be disabused of many of my fantasies about Prince Charming. And I'm like, I want a gay erotic fantasy that is attainable. And that show argues that if you meet somebody that you have great sexual passion with and they treat you like garbage for 10 years, just stick around because it probably will turn out that they'll change and they'll become your husband.
Oh, God.
I have never known that to be true, ever in my life. I have met a million incredibly hot guys that I've had incredible passionate sex with who ghosted me and never talked to me again, and no amount of waiting around for them changed anything. So I had to grow up and say, if I want a sustainable, passionate relationship, it will have to be based on mutual growth and mutual presence. And I'm not going to run after people that are not available.
I'm thinking about how, the longer I live, the more and more I realize that we're all a bunch of problematic people with bunches of faults and failures and all of this.
Absolutely.
And that like trying to kind of curate like a bunch of people that are going to always treat me right at all times is a fantasy. It's not going to happen.
There's no way.
And yet, of course, I also need to figure out like what are the boundaries of how much I can put up with. I guess I could put it that way, or like what.
That's great. Yeah.
Right. What are our boundaries? What can we live with? How can we coexist? I mean, how
Absolutely.
do we decide how to kind of curate our time with people? With people that are difficult to coexist with and to continue to coexist?
How I love this question. The answer is practice. That's it. You practice being around people. You practice conflict. You allow yourself to be hurt. And then you say to someone, that really hurt my feelings. And you see how they respond. And then you see how your body responds. You pay attention to your nervous system and you learn what you're capable of handling and what you're not. And then you maybe stretch into the places where your nervous system is very fragile or very sensitive, and you see how much could I grow here? How much could I be able to handle? It is a constant balancing act. There is a reason why so many people on the social justice left have very strict rules about care and harm. That's like, if you say one thing to me that I don't like, I'm cutting you off. If you do this, we're never talking. They're essentially saying, I don't want to have to do the really difficult, painful work of constantly negotiating the fact that I feel differently about people in every different context. I would rather a set of rules about social conduct that I could apply to the social field, and then I don't have to do any other emotion work. That's always a disaster. There are no universal pre-existing rules of care, empathy, belonging, political correctness that could be applied everywhere at all times. There's just no way. It has to be case by case. And that work requires you to develop a muscle of emotional intuition. You just have to be out and about around people. You have to talk to people. The number of times in my early career, I wanted to school students about things they were saying or thinking that seemed very problematic to me. And then realizing like, this doesn't work. This makes people crawl into their shell. They don't want to talk. They feel like I'm being judgmental. This is not a good way of approaching this. And I had to loosen up and start just being curious and asking questions. So that would be part 2, is like not only being around people, how do you get better at navigating these very complex social dynamics? You lead with curiosity and questions. Like, hey, I wonder why somebody's behaving this way. I wonder why someone seems really irritable today. I wonder why somebody would say something kind of offensive like that. Instead of starting from, you said something offensive, we need to practice living among other people and being uncomfortable and all of that. That's like core to my last trip. I think my last therapeutic trip was about like, I'm okay. Like at the core of my being, I fundamentally trust myself. So when I'm deeply uncomfortable, it is okay because I will get back to homeostasis at some point. My nervous system is a biological structure that has evolved over millions of years. And if it is that refined and if it has spent that much time evolving, then my body is capable of handling every single emotional possibility that exists on this planet, because that nervous system that each of us has been evolving in relationship to everything that is in the world currently for millions of years. It gave me a deep sense of trust that I can withstand the general range of all the different interpersonal interactions that the world can throw at me. That doesn't mean that I want to experience those things all the time. It doesn't mean that I want to be in a state of being aggressed upon or hurt or whatever, but that I'm capable of taking it all in.
Yeah. I think it relates to what I think you were talking about, groundlessness, like this ability to encounter uncertainty. And I feel like to some degree, you know, our generation and older, just that was our growing up was a little bit more of that uncertainty. Yeah. And also it's related a lot to class and to different kind of where you grew up and how, of course, this also changes that sense of whether or not you encounter a lot of uncertainty. But I feel like this you know, there's this sense that a privileged life is one in which there's very little uncertainty. You know exactly what you're going to get in the mail. Yeah. You know, and you know what you're going to find. And of course, I mean, I completely agree with you. It's really hard to handle what you don't expect, people that you don't expect, emotions that you don't expect if you don't flex that muscle. But the question is how now? You know, how do we do that more in the world in which we're now living?
It's cliche because I'm a teacher, is you can only do it in conversation with others. That's it. It cannot be, there's a huge amount of things you can do by yourself. You can learn to meditate, to sit with your emotions. You can go to therapy. You can do all of these different things. But at the end of the day, the rubber meets the road when you encounter other people and you take in their perspectives and you allow those perspectives to change you. Like, you have to be willing to be changed by what somebody says. And that is a form of groundlessness. Like, we live in a world where so much in the world feels precarious. The economy, our access to health, like the future, the climate, whatever, that what we do is we compensate for that instability by clinging unbelievably fast to categories that are familiar. And we think that those categories will provide us solace. But the reality is those categories will always fail us. Categories under-describe us all the time. You know, I joke with my students all the time. It's like you will cling really fast to queerness or to transness or to whiteness or to blackness or whatever. And then you will go hang out with all those people who inhabit that identity and you'll discover you're nothing like most of them. You're always being reminded that the categories you're most attached to do not fully describe you adequately because you're that complicated and multidimensional. And so for me, it's about learning to hold less fast to identities, to find some other form of bonds with other people that's not based on pre-existing ground of what we claim to share. You know, I already believe this, and this. That's the ground upon which I do my politics. Do you believe those things? That's a lot of what happens in both social justice spaces and conservative political spaces. Here's a checklist of beliefs that I have about immigration, about Zionism, about this, about that. Do you also believe them? So that's a ground. That's an imaginary ground that we've produced where we say we cannot even engage in politics unless we already agree on these grounds. Right? And it's like, that's exhausting and it's not true to life. We need to be able to find other ways to connect in the absence of a shared ground. And you know what's beautiful about doing that? When you practice that more and more often, you become less attached to the most pernicious conservative categories in our society. You become less worried about this tribe and that group and this whatever. And you start thinking like, what are problems that we need to solve collectively and what does it look like to solve them?
I mean, I absolutely agree with you, but I still have trouble finding, and I think that this is where I feel like I'm essentially an ideas person. I'm very, in my head. I love critical theory. I loved what I learned in books and in school and from professors. And then I do take it to the streets and I find I fail, like, basically.
Totally.
I was doing sound on a protest, and someone grabs the mic whose sound system it belongs to, because we're borrowing, because we're allies, and then they start saying homophobic things, and that's because in that setting there are other people that share those beliefs, and yet there are also other people who really don't. What do I do in that situation? And then I see somebody else act, because I have failed to act, and then somebody else makes the decision for me, and I may not even agree with the decision that they've made, because they grab the mic out of the person's hand, or they do. I don't know. I fail.
So instead of seeing it as a failure, you just see it as one opportunity among many to refine your critical judgment. Because first of all, number one, theory is at its best. Critical theory is at its best when it emerges out of lived conditions. Like when it is not just an abstract idea that's laminated onto the world, but like an idea that comes from the world. So if you go back to Judith Butler's notion of gender performativity, Butler very famously grounded that in watching drag performance. Like, drag performance was a quotidian, everyday, idiosyncratic performance practice that Butler watched over and over and noticed, like, wow, there is this slippage in the way that gender is performed here that suggests that people in the know sort of winkingly know that gender is made up. That it's something that we're just performing, and we could also fail at performing it. So Butler then theorizes from a lived reality into gender performance. Linda Zerilli will later come around and reread or reinterpret Butler and say, people made it sound like Butler's great intervention was to say all gender is just false and socially constructed. And Zerilli's like, no, that's not the genius of the argument. The genius of the argument is that we can see gender as a performance in everyday practices like drag. Like, she brought it down to earth. She made it really grounded in lived everyday relations. So this is why whenever theory becomes too abstract, it fails on the ground, because it becomes a set of rules against which we try to measure everyday life. Let's face it, there's a lot of trans people for whom they don't feel that gender's a performance. They're like, I want to be this gender, fuck off.
Exactly.
Right? Like,
exactly.
You can tell them all the Judith Butler theory that you want, and they're like, but I want to be this gender, and I don't want it to seem like a performance. So real life reminds you that you have to operate beyond theory. Theory is useful. It's explanatory. That's what theory does. It's an explanatory framework. It helps you understand things, but it cannot function as a rule book by which to operate. So you use the word act, and that is the operative word. That in the moment, theory goes out the window and you just have to act. And you will not always act in a way that later you will like. You might look back and say, I didn't love the way I acted there. I wonder how I could do it differently next time. But every single instance of action is fully spontaneous, and you need to respond to that moment. And that's why the only way that we get better at that is just being out in the world with people and practicing.
You just heard from queer cultural critic, educator, podcaster, and public speaker Ramzi Fawaz. You can read more about him at ramzifawaz.com and in the show notes. I'm Mad Kate, and you've been listening to S.W.E.A.T, Sexuality, Work, Extraction, Art, Theatrics. S.W.E.A.T is a series of conversations about performance and performativity of the sexual and sexualized body in work. The theme music was composed by me and features the voice of performer and actress Lori Baldwin. S.W.E.A.T airs first every second Tuesday of the month at 13 hours Central European Time on Collaboratio. Afterwards, it's available for streaming wherever you get your podcasts. S.W.E.A.T is a labor of love. Your support would be greatly appreciated through my Patreon page. Thanks so much. Until next time.